Today we speak with David Chandler, historian of Cambodia, biographer of Pol Pot, and researcher of the S-21 prison under the Khmer Rouge. Professor Chandler gave expert testimony at the ECCC during the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in 2009 and 2012, where he was invited to detail his study and findings. Peg LeVine joins us for our discussion as well. She is a medical anthropologist, clinical psychologist, sculptor, scholar, and clinician who addresses mass killing and torture. Following her book publication, Love and Dread in Cambodia, Weddings, Births, and Ritual Harm Under the Khmer Rouge, she gave expert witness at the ECCC in 2016. Both David and Peg are with Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Together they discuss the fallout from genocide and crimes against humanity, genocide priming, and whether genocide prevention is possible. We narrate atrocity from Cambodia to Gaza to Afghanistan and beyond.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Hello to all of you today. I am very happy to have you on our platform, and I'm very happy and pleased and honored to have you, David Chandler, on the platform to have this important conversation with regarding the Khmer Rouge, regarding the Cambodian genocide, regarding the past, therefore, but also the future, because we are now facing a lot of issues that are entangled with what happened in the past too, and which you have experienced directly, indirectly, and you've written about in scholarly ways. So without further ado, I would love to hear from Peg.
Thank you, Sabah. So David asked me to just address the United Nations definition of genocide before we begin. And I just want to say that it, as many people would know, Raphael Lemkin had coined that in 1944, just taking that Greek prefix genos, race or tribe, and combining that with the Latin suffix side, meaning killing. And from that, then the criteria was developed that we'll speak to today, including, I'll say at the beginning, the misconception of and use of the concept Cambodian genocide. We'd like to clarify that. David will clarify that as well, in terms of clarifying that from genocide and crimes against humanity. So David, the first question for you to think about today is, when people hear the word genocide today, what common misunderstandings do you think that they have?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me here. I'm going to contest the phrase Cambodian genocide because I think what happened in Cambodia was awful, diabolical, if you like, but was not genocidal except in the rare exception of any Vietnamese who were left in the country while the regime was in power. They were genocidally targeted, but did not amount to very many people. What happened in Cambodia was much more like what happened in Indonesia in 1965, or in other places where the regime went after its enemies, its political enemies, not its racial enemies, political enemies, and committed a crime against humanity, such as the massacres in Indonesia, 65-6. So I think a problem with the genocide thing is that Cambodians themselves knew, as we all do in the room, that something terrible had happened in Cambodia between 75 and 79, and it wasn't less horrible than what happened to the Jews in World War II. It was still mass killings that were sponsored by the government, and Cambodia wanted to be entitled to participation in a community of genocided of places where genocide had been committed. The Vietnamese occupation in the 80s encouraged this view to get them off the hook from the fact that their war against Cambodia, which had involved a lot of killing also, was political rather than genocidal. They pick me up word on this, but I don't want to use the phrase Cambodian genocide. I don't know something easier to use, but I don't think that's an accurate phrase myself.
So David and I have talked a lot about genocide is now rank ordered as the worst mass murder, when in fact there's criteria that has to be met in terms of intention that takes decades to happen. And so marching for genocide as opposed to, or marching against genocide as opposed to marching against crimes against humanity, in a way gets in the way of decreasing massacres in the long run. So David and I talk a lot how we don't rank order genocide as the worst crime.
Simply put, whenever genocide occurs, it is inevitable that crimes against humanity also occur. A crime against humanity exists whenever there is a widespread or systematic attack against any civilian population taking the form of various types of acts, such as murder, serious bodily injury or mental harm, enforced sterilization, and forcible transfer of population. In short, all of the acts identified in Article 2 of the Convention Against Genocide. While crimes against humanity can occur in a situation where genocide is not occurring, the opposite is not true. Commission of genocide inescapably entails crimes against humanity.
I will chime in here because even as a legal scholar, it did not make much sense that when genocide has been restrictively, without argument nowadays, restricted to committing, to killing a group of people, to killing a people. Of course, it was based on the Holocaust in many ways, and that's why it was restricted in its definition. Applying the word genocide to the Cambodian case feels like a misnomer because the court, the ECCC, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, had to find a roundabout way to say that there was genocide based on the massacre of the Cham Muslims and the Vietnamese during that time. Whereas we know very well that the main target of that takeover by Pol Pot and his regime were actually the people of Cambodia, the Khmer. So it was Khmer people killing other Khmer people. And I understand, therefore, that because of this restricted definition, it's hard to use the term genocide. But having said that, now the issue is that we don't have an alternative term for the word genocide. So what do we do?
You don't have to use an alternate word. There's a phrase, crimes against humanity, which covers genocide and all sorts of mass killings. I think that's okay to use. It doesn't have the same prestige as the word genocide. It never gets the kind of funding that genocidal studies get, but I think it's a much more accurate blanket term to cover all sorts of bad behavior by governments toward their own people. But we'll continue today to talk about it, because I agree. The court finally, after 10 years, had lots and lots of negative evidence, felt they had to say something. And they did say about the Vietnamese, the evidence against the Chams is much less complete. It was leapt on by the Vietnamese the minute they arrived in 1980. to suggest that's what the Khmer Rouge had done. And you find writings about that in the early days of the PRK, that Chams were made to eat pork and to cut their hair. And this is considered genocidal behavior. Well, I'm just not buying into that.
So perhaps there's not a term yet for what happened in Cambodia. Let's work on that. I mean, it's interesting, when I did my research in Cambodia, of which I'm, privileged to, it was my second doctorate, David Chandler so generously agreed to be my supervisor of that PhD fieldwork that I did. And that was really looking at very strategically over many, many documents, including documents of cartographers that had come into Cambodia and had really very delicately, observed and did their ethnographic studies on rituals. And so what I did in Cambodia was I just mapped the ritual breakdown and ritual harm by the Khmer Rouge, and eventually ended up, through that database calling it Ritualcide. And for me, instead of getting stuck on these terms, genocide, I really want to spend some time today looking at genocide priming. Because for me, the minute we start seeing ritual sites and traditional rituals and people not having, the particular white cloth to wrap the dead in, then we're on the way to genocide. And so the question that you had asked originally, Sabah, was really about, are there warning signs or patterns that lead to genocide? And I think that's a really very important question to address today. I mean, I can even think of, I did an article in 2023, and the title of that article was, I think I have it here, Psychological Torture to Children in Gaza is Genocide Priming. That was December 21st, 2023. It's nearly 2 years later, and the International Genocide Organization just came out with a statement around genocide. The time to really move in there is when it's being primed, and how we measure those priming data. And I'd like David to talk a little bit about the priming of mass violence in Cambodia, because he and I did an article together. I wrote the article, but I interviewed David for it, on the trajectory of a regime. And I think rather than going over things again about what is genocide, what is not genocide, can we call it genocide, I'd like to spend time on the priming of genocide today.
So the question to you, David, is when it comes to genocidal priming, and it's important to know what are the warning signs of an impending genocide in a country or in a territory. So what are your discoveries and your unravelings through the studies you have done with regard to this topic of genocidal priming and warning signs?
I think probably what indicator would be a widespread dehumanization of the people you're setting out to kill. This would certainly be the case in Rwanda. I think it's the case in Palestine today. It was very much the case during the Holocaust. The people who were targeted were given no humanity. They had their humanity removed. Well, I guess partly to excuse or calm what was going to happen, or to lie about it later. So I think the early signs would be the existence in a society of two groups, one all holding all the power and one without the power, with the powerful one trying to eliminate the other one. And there were certainly, I think, early signs in Rwanda. There were early signs in Armenia. These are places that I would call genocidal. Early signs up in Sudan today is going to, and there's a group of people in Afghanistan that Peg has worked on that is also being targeted as a group of that religion is full of people without any humanity, full of non-people. I think that would be an early sign to look for.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd like to add to that is is really how polarization enters that sort of mindset, especially when I think, I think a lot about the role of monotheist nations, one God nations, and what that sets up in terms of the polarization and the language that we hear on a regular basis. The term evil. I mean, I hear genocide scholars use that word. I would never use that word, because then we have good, and then we have justification for taking on the evil, or even I've heard recently devil doers. So it's so complex, I guess, is the point. It's complex in terms of borders, in terms of justification, even though we have to prove intent. We're not mapping the justification of the murders along the way. And so I think breaking down, some of what David said, the dehumanization, it's not so simple.
There is a split in the scholarly establishment about how a genocide comes about. And the split, which gave rise to these two main advocacy organizations today, which is the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and on the other hand, we have the International Network of Genocide Scholars. Now, the split, as some of us have heard, happened. Well, one of the reasons was because there was a split in terms of their ideology or their take on prevention of genocide. Most specifically, one group believes that genocide can be prevented, and the other group believes that genocide is a result of nature, that you can't stop human beings from perpetrating genocide, from engaging in genocide, and that all we can do at most is to be there when it happens and to minimize the effects. So David, this is a question to you primarily. In your study of what happened during the Khmer Rouge rule between 1975 and 1979, including the time before and after that, because we know that the war never really ended and that the war went on among different parties before and after. What is your take on this big question about genocide and prevention?
Well, first of all, I tend to agree, though I'm not happy to do so, because it's the sad thing to say. Violence will be with us forever, I think, I'm afraid, as far as forever goes. But one of the points we haven't mentioned before, which I think is important in trying to get early signs of genocide is where the people in command or the top layers of the society have said in public statements that a certain group in the society did not have a right to exist. This is starting to prove intent, which is one of the hardest things to prove in any genocidal issue. And I know the Cambodian case, there was a time in 20 years ago, 30 years ago, some law students were brought out from the United States to do research in Cambodia and to carry out a mock trial to answer the question of was what happened in Cambodia genocide or not. And these were law students from some pretty well-known law schools, and they came down resoundingly in favor of its not being genocide because they were unable to locate any aspect of intent, where there were people who had power talking about disempowering another group of people, except as the court finally found, this did apply in the way Cambodia is talked about and treated Vietnamese. But that was a small group. It was pushed ahead in the 80s by the Vietnamese occupation as genocide to show, this is using the archaic language of the day, that Khmer Rouge had been a fascist organization. And what fascist organizations did was genocide. What communist organizations did, like Stalin and so forth, could never conceivably commit genocide. That was not they were incapable of genocide. I don't think anyone's incapable of genocide, but that was the propaganda that caught hold very quickly, including among the Cambodian diaspora who insisted that what had happened to them was so awful, they wanted to call it genocide.
You are talking about different factions, different players here. We're talking about the Cambodians, the Vietnamese. We also have the infamous carpet bombing by the US forces in Cambodia. We have the involvement of the Chinese communists who were advisors to the Khmer Rouge for a long time. But my point in all of this is every time people start learning about genocide, they always think that there is one clear-cut perpetrator and one clear-cut victim. And time has revealed the truth. For instance, in the Rwandan genocide, we now understand that the story was more complex. Even in the case of the Holocaust, we have the Sonderkommandos, who were probably a shock to the senses of many people who had to accept that the Jews and the Romas and the other minorities were not victims rather all the time, but that some of the Jews also participated in persecuting the rest of the Jews during that period while working together with the Nazi forces. So my question to you is, in your research on Cambodia, did you also come across this complexity?
No. I didn't find ethnic or religious groups. No, I see what you're saying. In Europe, I've just been reading a wonderful book about the Ukraine, and that was just a soup of different nationalities and religions and the persuasions, the political views. People picked all kinds of different sides in World War II, and very hard to pull out, say, just the Germans as the guilty party. There was plenty of other anti-Semitic outfits in Europe. There were plenty of people who were killing political enemies who were not necessarily Jewish. So it does indeed get very complicated, but I don't see any problem myself. I don't see any problem in including genocide when it is actually fits the UN definition, and there's several aspects of that are quite uncontroversial. Fitting that inside a much larger framework of crimes against humanity, which are easier, easier, but maybe less difficult to bring to trial, which is other question in our talk, is the only thing that can be done about genocide is once it is ended one way or another, that the perpetrators can be brought to court. And if it's so hard to prove genocide, it's not hard at all to prove crimes against humanity, which do not seem to be less serious than genocide. The people who are killed are just as dead as the other ones. The violence and the hatred on the part of the killers is just the same. There's no lesser category.
Well, what I'd like to do is to hold the context of Cambodia a bit, which is that it's Buddhist, but it's primarily animist, regardless of what religion someone may have. And I think that in my research, what I found is once I factored in that animist piece to the puzzle, I really understood a lot more about compliance. So in terms of your question about, people, sort of turning on their own, when you add that feature of animism, where someone could be possessed at any time, when people were confused about what is Angkar, it was supposed to be the quote organization. We would interpret that in the West as something very concrete, but within the context of Cambodia, people saw Angkar as being some force that they couldn't see, that could transform at any time, that could possess them, that could enter their minds and have them do terrible things. I mean, think of how fearful that is as a piece of psychological torture, that I can't even think, I'm not even free in my own mind because this perpetrating force could enter me and have me do bad things. And I think that's what makes the context of Cambodia, perhaps Rwanda, and other places very, very complicated. And so oftentimes what scholars do, the best of scholars, is they factor that piece out.
Yeah.
Especially when we're looking at, again, monotheist factors of what religion are they, Buddhist? Oh, that's not so simple. in Cambodia.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me because I remember in all my studies of the Khmer Rouge, the regime, and the way in which the organization Angkor, as you say, was set up, I was made to view it purely in materialistic terms and not in a supernatural way that you're describing, which makes a lot of sense to me. Just if I compare this situation with when I delved into or when I researched the case of Dominic Ongwen, the Ugandan child soldier, it was the same story of how Joseph Kony, brainwashed his followers into believing that the spirits and the supernatural forces were watching them, so that even when they did anything that was against the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, they thought that they were being watched and observed by whatever that feeling or that entity was that Joseph Kony had, brainwashed them about. So I do understand that there are these elements that are lost in the course of documenting things, which brings me to the next question, first directed to David, which is, you are the pioneer in terms of being the first to document the life of Pol Pot. And I would love to hear from you about the challenges you faced regarding that, and especially at a time where we did not have, for instance, the way we researchers today imagine researching things, where we have the internet, where we have access to online archives. You had to start from scratch in terms of gathering and collecting documents and putting them together and making everything make sense. So I'd love to know more about the challenges you faced in the course of collecting all the material to write this important book.
Well, thanks very much for generous comments. I never felt it was hard. I just kept working on what I was working on. Material came in, I did a lot of interviews. The Khmer Rouge documents came available in the 80s that one could read. There were lots of other people working on the Khmer Rouge whose work I consulted. I never met him. I had a dream once that he was looking at me. That was a tiny bit unnerving when I woke up, but otherwise it was doing the life of Pol Pot was much less involving than my work in the Khmer Rouge prison, because there I was getting inside their system as opposed to being an outside scholar trying to make sense of what had happened in the Khmer Rouge period. And I'm not sure that I got it all right, because apparently a biography of Pol Pot coming out now from somewhere, I forget, that wasn't really told where. Obviously, there's some survivors who will have some interesting things to say, and my book was out final, but I think for an historian, and I share this with lots of colleagues who are historians, there's a thrill of the chase when you're on a project. How much more can you find out? How do you, what new discoveries are made? How does it hang together? And Pol Pot eluded me as a human being, but I think I managed fairly well to describe the Khmer Rouge movement from start to finish, which was, I thought, was a very interesting project for me.
Over to you now, Peg. My question to you is, you did a lot of research, field research, you did, ethnographic research in Cambodia. And as a result of that, you wrote a book, which I read and I absolutely adored, called Love and Dread in Cambodia, Weddings, Births, and Ritual Harm Under the Khmer Rouge. So please tell us how that journey, that research journey started, because I have heard you before tell me that story, but I think it's fascinating for current and future researchers to hear.
Thank you. I mean, I developed a new methodology to do this. I just want you not to show my book, but just to hold up the book cover to show an image, because that gets lost in the press. So the image that the publisher had chosen, it wasn't my choice, but I actually liked that it was chosen. The image on the book cover that was chosen was taken from some field work I did that was different from that book, which was I went to the Cardamom Mountains. Didn't see a tiger. I was kind of disappointed, but I went to the Cardamom Mountains and I interviewed spirit mediums. I filmed them. I watched them go into trance. I watched former Khmer Rouge, go into these little huts so they could speak to deceased relatives. But before those ceremonies happened, the spirit medium would take a umbilical cord that was dried, that was dressed up, which is the cover of the book. It's a dressed up umbilical cord. It's bound in gauze because that umbilical cord has some special powers because it was an umbilical cord that came from a woman who gave birth. The cord was wrapped around her neck and she survived. So that was used in ceremonies. The reason I mention that is because I just want to keep this animist piece going through the work that I did. I had a very strong interest in that. But yeah, I didn't intend to do that study. I had taken a PhD student to Cambodia. At that time, I was doing two things. I'm a clinician first. So I was working at Chumni's Hospital, which is the hospital that was the psychiatric hospital before the Khmer Rouge took over. Now it's run by Dr. Bumi. It's a child family health center where we do use monks and traditional healers in practices there. I was bringing qualitative research into the University of Phnom Penh in their psychology department. I was at an afternoon tea, and there was a colleague of mine. We were having sitting sort of on the ground, eating some fruit, and my colleague, Professor his wife, leaned back into him. And she was massaging him. And in that moment, I said, "Oh, I'd really like to know more about your relationship." And they told me that they were married under the Khmer Rouge. And I said, because I had read all the literature and historians' remarks on the weddings, I said, "Oh, you were married in the forced weddings." And they said, "Our weddings weren't forced." And I had cognitive dissonance in that moment because I had bought the story. And so I thought, wow, this is really big. This is really important because I knew that the tribunal was going to happen, and at least there was talk of it going to happen. I came back to Melbourne and I asked one of my students who was wanting to look for a PhD project, I asked her to do that study. Now, retrospectively, I am so glad I took her to Cambodia and she decided it's not what she wanted to do. I thought it was so important that I went back to do a second doctorate in medical anthropology so I could hold that animist piece. And that's how I met Professor Chandler more officially.
So I think we need to clarify here just for the audience that the importance of your finding rather, is that the mainstream perspective and all that I had also read in all the books on the history of the Khmer Rouge and what happened during that crucial period was that Khmer women who were from the elite, the so-called bourgeoisie class, were forcefully married to the proletariat class. I mean, this is the distinction that, of course, the regime made at the time. And so their menstrual cycles were tracked. They were made to have children, etc., etc. So that sounded really terrible, of course. But what you're trying to point out, which I really appreciate, is that in all of these stories, as mentioned earlier, there is more nuance and complexity. It's never just one single narrative about what happened. So you discovered that among the many people who were definitely forcefully married rather under the regime, there were also these exceptions. And these are the findings that you first came across. Is that correct?
That's actually not correct. They weren't the exceptions.
Tell me more.
So I went back to look at some of the former press about the weddings being considered forced, and I didn't find any representative samples. They were just being framed that way. There were anecdotal. There were very small bits of data of things that people had spoken about. And so I wanted to do more random sampling where I wasn't looking specifically for a population that fit underneath this ideology, if you will. And so that's how I decided to create a research study where I would triangulate the content, the process, and the context. And so in doing that, I wanted to get visual data. So I used film ethnography. So I traveled with people to places so they could tell me their stories. And what I found as a psychologist was when they were at the site where things happened to them, sometimes it was as if people would go into trance recounting the story and trying to get the facts right. The place has memory. So if somebody's going to tell a story in an office or in their own home now, it's very different than the story that comes out at the place. Of course, I had to deal with re-traumatization for people, going back to locations. So yeah, I think it was that my study, I tried to be as true to methodology as possible.
So this is interesting. You go against the grain of things because of this finding that you have. And obviously it goes against what we call the master narrative. There is a master narrative in everything that happens around us, whether it's a story we tell about ourselves or whether it's a story of a genocide in a specific location. So here is a question to both of you, to David and to Peg. While being these researchers that you were and are in the context of the Khmer Rouge, did you often come across instances where you went against the grain of things and had data that defied the master narrative? And right now, the first person who comes to my mind is another very controversial figure called Michael Vickery. His book, which I read, and I remember being completely taken by the work because he presented me which I liked, again, with more complexity than what I'd understood. For instance, one of the premises or one of the methodological flaws that Michael Vickery spoke about in terms of the research and collection of data that went on during that period was that he said, it's not like, say, four journalists or 4 researchers did their separate individual research on each region, because you know that Cambodia was divided into different zones during the Khmer Rouge. He said that sometimes these researchers came back and just piggybacked on each other's research and corroborated it without having gone in those places and done first-hand research or the first-hand inquiry. So again, sorry, but this is a bit of a digression here, but this is to cite an example of someone who was presenting something completely different. What do you both feel about this? Did you face such situations? How complicated did it become? And what are your conclusions now, in hindsight, about these complications?
I mean, I met Michael once, and I have to say in my work, because I wanted to get a representative sample from every single region of the country, what I appreciated about Michael Vickery's work was that it was the only scholar I found who actually gave validity and reliability to the work that I was doing, to the question that I was answering, or trying to answer. Like David, I sniffed it out. I had to keep going. I had to keep going until I exhausted my sample and found so many patterns and themes that I could say, okay, finally it's done. So yeah, I think if we're staying true to methodology, and I'm talking about really good methodology, then we can't have an opinion. It has to emerge. I mean, to me, it's about emergent research leads to that which is closer to reality. And that's what I was interested in. What's real? I was just like, what is going on? I've got to figure this out. I've got to find this out. Is this just a sample of an N of 1 with this couple that are leaning back in this really loving way? So yeah, I think like David, you just sniff it out.
So David, back to you here. My question is the same as was directed to Peg. I'm asking you as a scholar whether you had to face situations where you had to go against the grain of things, and how you face this opposition or this possible opposition.
I never thought of it that way. I think there were some people who climbed into the Khmer Rouge studies that looked kind of a bandwagon, and I don't think an historian business is to support the policies of any regime anywhere. If his or her view is to find out what went on insofar as you can find that out from all kinds of sources like interviews and documents and so on. So I never joined the people who thought the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia was a good idea, or that the Vietnamese had Cambodian interests in mind. I didn't join on to the genocidal bandwagon. I didn't feel I was going against the grain to show, particularly in my book about the prison, how perfectly awful the Cambodians could behave toward their political enemies, or perceived political enemies. It's more and more a Soviet type thing, in the sense that you were not arrested because you were guilty, but guilty because you've been arrested. And that was the model they followed. So I wasn't, it wasn't my business to sit in judgment, but I tried to set out evidence that would tell readers that the awful history of the Khmer Rouge had lots of conflicting elements, such as Vietnamese, Cambodian xenophobia toward the Vietnamese, Vietnamese, as was mentioned earlier, the Chinese backing regime they must have known was completely hopeless, but was copying them to the letter, and copying the Chinese to the letter meant that hundreds of thousands of people died in completely meaningless operations copied from operations in China and Soviet Union. So, I mean, I never considered myself with the grain or against the grain or what a grain, but I was trying to be honest and using as many sources as I could. Michael is who was an old friend of mine, but then he parted company with me for reasons of his own. And so for the last 10 years of his life, he kept attacking me, which was okay because, as my wife said, was Michael's family. So, but his work on the Khmer Rouge it's pretty good, but he put on a second edition 10 years later with no alterations at all and no new citations. He never read the stuff that had been published in those 10 years. I thought this was not an honest way to behave, but I'm a great admirer of much of his work, and we were friends for a long time.
So here is a cheeky question, but to both of you, because, you know, Peg, you also do very heavyweight work where you deal with trauma victims and you deal with trauma as a general topic in the work that you do. If you had a choice, would you still do whatever you're doing or whatever you've done? So this is directed to both of you. I mean, genocide is obviously a very heavy topic, and I just thought of this question off the top of my head. Having seen and experienced the trauma, you do have scholars who end up being indirectly exposed to the trauma and violence of a genocide. So what do you feel about that? Do you feel that this has adversely affected the way you look at the world or the way you understand things? Has it made you, for instance, more disillusioned?
Yeah, I mean, for me, my work is really more in the area of torture than trauma. And there's a big term in the mental health literature on being trauma informed. I want to be responsive, not just informed. But my work is really in that torture. It's work that I don't talk about very often. It's not dinner party information that I would be giving in terms of the torture that I have to think about. So I want to do two things with your question. One is I just want to return to that prevention question because it's embedded in my response. And the other is I just want to add the word peace and my thinking on that as well. So, I mean, because psychological torture is an artifact of massacres, it's an artifact of mass murder, it's an artifact of ritualcide. My real love and interest is in, you know, what happens when these scorched earth wars bomb the hell out of people's ritual sites and doesn't give them access to ritual objects and ritual sequence. We can talk about ritual. Oh, they can still do a ritual. They can still do a prayer, such as, doing prayers in a concentration camp. But the sequence is missing. And once the sequence goes missing, then the ritual capacity is lost. So I want to just say that I dwell in this, and I get fascinated. It's gonna sound, it's not as if I dissociate from my own emotional experience. I'm fascinated by the human imagination. So going back to your question, Sabah, about prevention, but I'm in the network camp. I don't think genocide will be prevented. I think we can do a hell of a lot better to point out the priming factors and to really look and hold the crimes against humanity first that is so much easier to bring forward to courts. I think we can do better at that. But when I think about imagination, I think about going down a rabbit hole this week, looking at all the inventions at times of war, whether it's nylon and nylon stockings during World War II, or David said penicillin, or whether it's, new bombs or four-wheel drive vehicles came out of war. The way humans use their imagination for cruelty, I think that has happened throughout time. I believe it's not going to stop. And so with that, there will be torture, because every time there's war, this is my field, there are new methods of torture that are invented. Yeah, for me, I can't not do what I do. Of course, I'm an artist, so I sculpt. And whether it's me, sculpting the story that I need to get out of my body and then telling stories about that or animating that. I mean, I have found ways to dwell in my body in a healthy way by looking after myself, organic diet and running and yoga and all those other things, so that I can do the work that I love doing. I will not retire. I don't know the meaning of that term, because this is going to continue beyond my lifetime. And as long as I'm here, I just want to be able to just nudge a little bit more and a little bit more. And if I could say what came out of that book that I did, and that pretty much 10-year study that I did of field work, is number one, trying to challenge the feminist Western narrative about marriages in a country where there are arranged marriages through to today, not always liked by children that their families, sort of arrange. But Ritualcide would be the piece that I'd like to bring more into genocide literature, around getting better at looking at how the breakdown of ritual is a precursor to. So that's sort of some of the work that I'm moving towards, but always torture, to find ways that we can assist the imaginations that have been harmed by torture. Because that's what gets harmed, is imagination, human imagination.
I do want you to tell us a little bit more about Ritualcide. I mean, what happens when we get rid of rituals in a community that is married to them? What are the repercussions on the people and on their well-being, and the way in which they deal or they cope with various major events in their life?
Without really taking that into a whole monologue dialogue, I'm just going to cut to the chase and stay within the animist frame for now, and perhaps the varied religious frames when people don't have access to places and sequence, etc., is by introducing the word peace, because we have pieces just being talked about every day now. The peace deal. I mean, I could digress into that for an hour. But for me, if I hold psychological torture as an area of my work, peace is the absence of fear. And so if people don't have ritual touchstones, places, there's a particular kind of fear, there's a particular kind of dread, there's a particular kind of guilt. I didn't do enough. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I have interviewed and really dear friends of mine in Cambodia, other colleagues who say, you know, when my father died, I couldn't put his head facing west in the right place. Or when my baby died, I couldn't bury the placenta in the right soil to rest our baby's spirit. And so that's that tension between not having access to rituals and like an unfinished unrest in someone. I think to be able to not reenact rituals today, as some forms of therapy, are trying to be invented in Cambodia. Oh, we'll have this ceremony. There's a foreverness. And I think that's what needs to be recognized, is not to sort of take a Pollyanna view and say, oh, we'll just do a prayer for the deceased, or we'll just do this on this holiday. No, how does somebody live in the foreverness? And I think David and I talk about how we live in the foreverness of mass violence, genocide. We live in that. We dwell in that. And how we do that, different from each other. David writes poetry and does other things. I do my thing. I think that's a very interesting question for the future.
That was also something I was thinking about. It's not just about the rituals were taught because they're passed down by tradition or religious belief. It's also the traditions we hold on to on a daily basis, and maybe that we concoct, we invent, and that give us the kind of centeredness that we seek. So I'm also thinking about a friend of mine who insisted, she's Muslim, and she insisted on burying her cat, in the direction of the Kaaba, which would sound a little humorous to even those who are practicing. But then when you think about the importance the cat had to her and the importance of burying the dead in the direction of the Kaaba had to her, all of this makes a lot of sense.
It's a deep honoring. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so having said that, I think we haven't heard David. David, I have the same question for you. If you had a choice today, looking back on all that you have experienced, researching such a heavy topic, going through all these very important, not just researcher questions, but also political questions, because ultimately we know everything does become political. What do you feel? Would you still do the same thing you did?
Probably not. It was at one time. It was very much in the context of the times I wrote it in. It was a exciting period in some ways, and I luckily have the time and a steady job. And once I'd written The Voices of S21, I really wanted to say goodbye to the Khmer Rouge. I'd spent enough of my time with these extremely tiresome people who couldn't see what was right, what was wrong, what was stupid, what was intelligent. And I had to live with these people for a long time. And I certainly wouldn't want to go back to it. I'm not unhappy with what I wrote. And I'm happy if more information comes in that it improves the knowledge of the period. There's nothing sacred about what I wrote. But I was very helped by a lot of serious and helpful scholars and friends and ordinary Cambodians. A brief anecdote I'll tell in relation to Peng's work. In 1984, I was invited up by the UN to talk to refugees in the UN camp Kawidang who were being refused entrance into the United States because they were, quotation marks, Khmer Rouge. Now, the people who were left in Kawidang in 1984 were people who were unable to get any sponsorship overseas. They were people almost entirely without skills. They were the Cambodian people I'd fallen in love with en masse when I was there in the 60s. And I found that my Khmer language skills came back, and I interviewed 300 of them. It was a wonderful experience and kicked me into writing my next books.
Looking ahead, obviously, while looking back, what gaps require attention in genocide study programs globally?
Well, I think they certainly should live on. I think an extremely difficult aspect of genocide studies nowadays, and I can say this as a person of no religious convictions, is that the whole case of what has been happening in Gaza for the last 2 years fits the definition of genocide like a glove. And Amnesty International, which is a cautious institution, I've done some work with them. They came out with it. Now, what is going to happen to that accusation? Who would ever go on trial? Where would it happen? And I think if anything did happen like that, a lot of light could be shed on how genocide works, because I agree with Amnesty. I think genocide is going on in Palestine, but it would have to have it in a judicial system that was respected internationally, and but that's the place where genocide studies should go, rather than smaller places that are just as clear-cut, but probably would draw less attention and less money. It would take a lot of money to fund this operation. But anyway, I think the future, that's where the future lies. I'm pessimistic about anything happening at all. But if something happens, I think the Palestinian case is the place to go.
I think it's about how people ask questions needs to be better formulated in genocide studies. For example, I never use the word why. That's me being a clinician as well. I would never say to a client, why did you do that? You know, why? It just is a question that has no place in the field. So why did they do that? Why did they do that? To me, it's really looking at holding that context, you know, examining the sequence of how things happen, and to keep that within a cultural context. I think of Papa Doc and the way he sort of used that kind of that spirit world in his regime. So it's really holding the context, asking questions that are more the when, the how, the where, looking at what gets in the way of something happening as much as how something happens. You know, it's like case formulation in psychology. I can't come to some kind of a diagnosis unless I do a very extensive case formulation. So for me, it's bringing case formulation at that level into genocide studies and widening genocide studies. How come it can't be crimes against humanity and genocide studies? So both of those are held equally. One's the umbrella, and we keep forgetting it's the umbrella.
Yes. So, I mean, what you're saying is, and if I have to rephrase this in my words, and correct me if I'm wrong here, first you speak about the why question and then the framing question. So the why question, of course, doesn't make a lot of sense to us scholars, because we know very well that even at an everyday level, when we ask someone, why did you do this? Often they concoct a discursive piece of reasoning to justify why they did something they did. And this piece of discursive thinking and reasoning is, for all you know, completely fabricated. It is appealing to reason, but at the base of it, it has no validity whatsoever, because we are just backtracking and trying to justify something by using some of the factors or variables known to us. There are too many unknown variables in the equation of why, or in the process of finding out why.
The worry for me, Sabah, is to ask a question why, it sort of just moves right into that sort of polarized thinking again. Why? Well, because, and you come to this sort of conclusion that is too simple. It's too simple.
And so now onto the question of framing, when you say that there is a way in which we recount something that happened, and sometimes maybe other factors are missed in the process of this telling. I believe that, I think this is again the big question about how do you tell history? How do you retell something that has happened in the past? And if someone has been at the forefront of creating that first blueprint for telling the story, whether it's the story of a genocide or the story of a murder or the story of a rape or whatever other crime or event, people tend to follow a previous model. And what you're seeing here is to rethink this model constantly, because every time we rethink the way of telling a story, we will find that there are many other variables and factors we've missed out in that telling, in the process of telling that story.
And we miss out on parallel history. So, David, mentioned earlier, my other work is really, I have a very strong interest in the Hazara genocide, especially looking at the factors of, once the US pulled out of Afghanistan, whoa,
yes,
the Hazara people are really just right there again in the center of genocide happening to them, and the world forgets. So it's how do we hold all the parallel stories that are happening at the same time, and how one country makes this decision and then it triggers something else again. Sort of, I think about, again, going back to peace. Dare I mention, you hear David's and my accent. We're both expats from the US living in Melbourne. Aren't we lucky? But, if I think about, say, the United States government right now that just made a peace deal with the Democratic Republic of Congo, and other African nations. So security, i.e. weapons, in exchange for coltan mining. We've just increased child soldiering. We've just increased human trafficking. We've just increased poverty as a result of a peace deal. And then people seeking refuge, such as I was involved in a Democratic Republic of Congo case in Japan and wrote a court report for a person seeking refuge in Japan. But the Japanese government was thinking of perhaps deporting this person back to a home country because of a peace deal in the Congo now. So these telling of stories and our terminology, I know we've been talking about genocide, but right now my shtick, if I can, be a bit Yiddish about it, my shtick is the way peace is being used. It's trickery right now. Trickery that's perpetuating some of the very violence that we're trying to, point fingers at. So it's very, very complicated. And so going back to scholarship, a scholar has to hold all those competing variables at the same time. So how do you hold that peripheral vision? How do we train scholars to hold that peripheral vision? I think we can do it better.
The G word carries a certain gravitas that has different effects on people. It has been connected with Gaza, obviously, and people are divided on the matter. But we're also using the G word in the context of America at the moment. We're talking about a possible civil war. There seems to be, and I say seeming because we do have the concept of framing as well, where the idea of framing is where media chooses the stories it wants to publish. So we'll never really know the entire truth in that sense. But right now, it does seem like there has been an increase in violence across the country when we hear of shootings mostly. And so with this in mind, with the murder of Charlie Kirk recently, and with just people feeling anxious that this country is going to collapse into some kind of civil war, my question, and this is a question I had while you were talking about doing research in a different country. Most of the time, American scholars left their country to go to other countries in the world to do research on genocide. You, and I say you, meaning you scholars, went to Cambodia. The Rohingyas right now are under threat. There is a genocide ongoing among the Uyghur Muslims. There are the Yazidis in Iraq. So with all of these cases that I mentioned, where all of you flew out and tried to make a difference there, what if something happens here? What are the kinds of differences the scholars who live here, what would they be able to do in this country if they were faced with something in their own territory?
I think for those of us living, say, us living here in Melbourne, in Australia with the government here, et cetera, and the ocean between, I think we live as scholars with less fear. So maybe we live in more peace. There's a sense of still second, this tension of second guessing. Is it okay how do I write this? Should I censor myself? For me, my answer is, I don't write opinions. I write things that are scholarly and stand in a context that may be mistaken out of context. But I think for people who are scholars, it's really hard to be free if you're living in fear. I mean, I'll just say one thing in relation to that, and that is that I've done quite a bit of work on the poets and writers following the atomic bomb. So the atomic bomb poets, I've written a lot on that, and artists after the atomic bomb when the US occupied Japan. They were not allowed to use the word related to anything to do with the bomb. So they used the term which Americans went during the American occupation, after the atomic bomb was dropped. They used the word picadon, which means flash boom, because it wouldn't get picked up in the censorship literature. But the censorship that happened during the American occupation, it's as if right now that America is occupying America. And so, I again have to turn to history and look at what does that do to creative expression for writers and for artists and for censorship.
That is so true. Yeah. And I think about a talk I attended recently by the editor-in-chief of the Spiegel, the German newspaper. And I think there was one sentence she uttered which really marked me. We all want to be on the right side. And here, right doesn't mean, of course, the political right as we know in America, but just simply we all want to be on the right side. And I think although we are all a little rebellious by nature, and some of us are more than others, and we like to say that we are going to defy convention and speak our minds, the truth is very often most of us conform. And when we conform, it's back to what she said. We like to be on the right side. So to avoid problems, whether in terms of our visas, our status over here, to avoid problems in terms of angering and upsetting the people around us, the establishment, the people who employ us, our colleagues, sometimes we end up censoring ourselves, basically turning to silence, or we speak and we say things in such a measured way that we seem to be just aligning ourselves to the right side of things. And you're right, you can't not be affected if you're a scholar and you're living in a country where you're heavily censored and where there is the constant threat of you facing anything, deportation to murder, to killing, to disappearances, to anything that is not aligned with what we've learned about our rights, our human rights, and the rights enshrined under all the amendments.
I think genocide studies is big in America because there's money for it. And their students can get into programs that exist in the university and so on. I think a lot of other countries are not as concerned about it as America is, or some Americans are. But to study genocide, I don't think you can be living in a genocidal country. You're too much trouble for yourself. I think you're going to get run over. You're going to get. You just look at the history of Russia and Germany. What happened to people who put their head up for 5 minutes? So that's being in America. But then, to my mind, what that does is what it's always done. that's why I don't like to use the word about Cambodia if possible, is it has overused the term in terms of what happened to the Jews under the Germans and others was absolutely horrific and highly documented. I'm not sure how many more original studies can be done with survivors, certainly with documents that are discovered in Russia and Germany and various places. Peg and I have run into this without too much animosity, is that people are not that interested in these non-Holocaust genocide studies unless they can get some country like Cambodia and puff some air into it, if you will, to expand it into being a wonderful place to study genocide, which it's not, because that's not what happened. But so the first part of your question, yes, it should be, but I'm pessimistic about it's happening, particularly because I'm worried about the fate of universities everywhere right now. I much prefer to resurrect or use more systematically the phrase crimes against humanity, because that seems to be what is happening to people to whom the genocidal studies people pay no attention. These include, as I mentioned, the Indonesians in 65, Vietnamese land reform, the various times when this happened, and all those studies can be treated without having to hang them on a genocidal hook. And you can decide about, look and see how horrible they were, how punitive they were, how many people died. Yeah. Whether that'll happen, I don't know, because genocide has got this life of its own, which is, I think, in the Cambodian case, it wasted a lot of time in trying to uncover what went on under the Khmer Rouge.
This is probably not known to our audience. The difference, or rather the use of crimes against humanity, or if ever someone is pressed with charges of crimes against humanity or genocide or war crimes, what should be remembered? What is, sorry?
Or both.
Oh, both, that's right. So, I mean, what should be remembered is that all of these three terms, so I repeat, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, carry the same punishment, the same kind of fetters that a tribunal would impose on a country having been guilty of that, or on people who have been guilty of any of these three charges. But the world currently is hung up on this word, because on the word genocide, because it carries the most gravitas, it has the most cachet compared to the other terms, war crimes and crimes against humanity, that have paled in comparison to it. But let's also not forget that just a few decades ago, a few centuries ago, actually, to be more specific, instead of the word genocide, because genocide is a newly coined term, it was the term atrocity that carried the kind of cachet that today the word genocide carries. And this was something revealed to us researching the subject through the work of Bruce Robbins, who wrote Atrocity, a Literary History. It's a recent publication in 2025, where he discussed how this term was then in fashion and carried that kind of moral disapprobation that today we associate with the word genocide. So the question is now, what's next? And we don't know that, but it's great that we're opening this conversation to discuss how the word genocide doesn't apply to all the terrible situations and wars that we have talked about, witnessed, discussed in the media. Is that maybe something we could all agree on, or are there different views? I'm open to that.
To me, I just want to say that what gets missing with the word genocide is how torture is used. We can think of torture, but it's really physical torture. But psychological torture keeps getting left out of the mix, when actually that is really part of genocide. So the psychological torture isn't, I just want to, I said it earlier, it's an artifact of mass violence of genocide, of massacres. And yeah, they're all equal in cruelty. And I think that's what goes missing when we rank order legal terms and we keep it in that legal proof sensibility, if you will.
I don't think what happened to people under genocide is worse than what happened to people in the land reforms of the Ukraine, or places where masses of people were killed by the government or a government for reasons of their own. Now, for several years, 98 to 03, we lived in America from Australia because my wife's mother was not well. And I taught at several universities a semester at a time because that's all they could afford to pay me. And I ran a course called Government-Sponsored Mass Killings in Asia since World War II. It was a very exciting course. It attracted 15 to 20 students, third and fourth year students. And we examined Indonesia, Vietnamese land reform, Great Leap Forward, Pol Pot, and there's another one. But 4 of them were, of course, Cold War connected by being communists, but the Indonesian one was not. So I was trying to say it was a phenomenon wider than going after just our enemies of the Cold War. I mean, I would love to. I was too lazy, I guess, to write a book about that, but it would have made an interesting book because it's an ethical course to teach, and I got very well motivated students. So I think something like that is a way to talk about mass killings that even takes you back from crimes against humanity. In everything we're talking about is mass killings is what we're talking about. And if that is so awful a concept, it really doesn't matter what name you give it, but you have to keep remembering all the human beings involved on both sides. And many, many sides as under the Holocaust. And that's a very rewarding thing to work on.
This has been Not to Forgive, but to Understand with our guests, David Chandler and Peg LeVine. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.